Hey, you know, if you tell somebody, I want an apple, they know what you're talking about. If I want a car, they know what you're talking about. It's like, what do you want? You can say anything and everybody knows what you're talking about. But if someone asks you, what do you want? And you say, I don't want anything. There's basically nobody on this earth that can wrap their brain around that. They immediately draw a blank. I say, what do you want? Like, I don't want anything. Huh? You speak in English? The same is true of rest. When we're talking about mystical union and divine ascent, I've said before countless times, and it is the case, that if it's true, and it's based in wisdom, and it's based in true union, it's often called MUO or MUO, mystical union with the One. It has to be hyper-logical and hyper-rational. And you can have many different takes on the same thing, and the methodology must necessitatively be the same. You know, how a fish understands water versus how you understand water. I mean, you're both thinking and understanding the same thing are completely different. You know, the fish swims in it and lives in it. You know, kind of a crude analogy, but you know, perspectives and analysis on things will vary. But the closer you get at the heart of anything, the irreducible simplicity everything becomes, and you're using different words to describe the same thing. So mystical union with the One or the divine ascent is all the same. I was looking for a rare book, and someone forwarded it to me, and usually even in the really, really good books of academia, which are 99% horrible, there's like a little gem of wisdom, because even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every now and then, and a broken clock is right at least a couple times in a 24-hour period. I got my hands on a book called Sethian Background of Plotinus's Mysticism. And I was reading like 62 pages, and I can read really fast. And, you know, I'll stumble across, you know, nothing that shocks me that I haven't come across before, but it's amazing how these academicians are. They don't understand anything. There's a reason why there's two sources of material that you can never get anything good out of. One is religion, organized religion, which is secularized metaphysics, and something even worse than that are the books of academia. Now, this is a really intelligent author, ancient Greek translator, highly intelligent, don't want to mention his name. I'm not dissing the book. I mean, it's a brilliant work of academia. But all of those books, and I've read more of these books and been through more of these books than all of you watching this video combined times 100. I mean, I do mean that literally, too. They all say the same thing. They never draw any conclusions about anything. Academicians are really good at that, because you can't attack anybody if they don't make any bold statements of fact about anything. It's a really neat and horrific, sophistic tactic of academia. And I'm getting on to mystical union and divine ascent here really quickly. I'm just pointing out the stuff that you can't read to get any answers from. Religious text and commentary, and the books of academia. So even this book is about the Sethian background of Plotinus's mysticism. And it's extremely well written and highly intelligent. You won't find any answers therein. They don't draw any conclusions, and they're not actually interested in practicing this themselves. I once knew a friend whose wife was the head of the nursing pediatrics section of a college in Georgia. Well, this woman not only never had any kids, but she despised children. But, you know, she's the head of, you know, the wing of the School of Medicine for children. Never had any, never wanted any, and didn't like kids. You know, you wouldn't, you know, take advice on dog and dog care from somebody that never had a dog and, you know, despised dogs, would you? Academicians are like this. What they'll do is they'll say, well, this is like this, and it seems like Plotinus borrowed this from Aristotle, and there's bits and pieces of this that seem like this stuff from this other stuff. And, you know, mysticism and apophaticism, which is the methodology of theology and mysticism, is truth-centric. It's wisdom-centric. It has nothing to do with time. Truth has nothing to do with time or what was borrowed from what. Well, it seems like Plotinus took a little bit of Aristotle over here, and a little bit of Pythagoras over here. None of that stuff matters. That doesn't help anybody. Life is short. So even when I was pouring through this book, and I'll actually even read a couple passages from the book, and then I'll analyze it, and we'll talk very quickly and get into the heart of the matter on mystical union and theology, because everybody asks about it, and it's like talking about rest. Yeah, that's an orange. Actually, this is a cara. But it's really simple, and it really is hyper-rational and hyper-logical. And all of this stuff, be it Greek, Indian, or Egyptian, is based on via negativa. And we have to engage in retroductive thought analysis here to say, well, if theology and mysticism and mystical union with the One is based in negation, specifically objective negation, obviously so. We can't engage in subjective negation unless you're a nihilist or a so-called Buddhist, and I'll get to that in a minute. Then what does this mean? This means that we identify and see ourselves as something other than that which we truly are. We see ourselves as the flesh and peel self, which is not the self, which fades away. And what would rest be? And of course, it takes growth and energy and sunlight to generate an apple or an orange. And then, of course, it sucks up water through various systems to actually feed the orange and the apple, which is mostly water anyway. So that would be consciousness self, or psychophysical self, i.e. the flesh of the orange, and also too the mentation and the veins of that which feeds the orange, that being the water and the nutrients and the minerals and whatnot. But since none of that is ourself, then ultimately we must be this rest self, because that involves activity, action, agency, and work. Because hell is perpetual agitation, and if hell is perpetual agitation, which it is, and the Vedas and the Upanishads and original Buddhism, and I stress original. And Buddhism is a term that didn't even exist until the 16th century, so even using that word is defunct. They all say the same thing, the subjugation of becoming, which is the same thing as saying agitation, perturbation, modulation, which is hell, which is existence. And it takes perturbation and the flow of water and minerals to create this orange. Like, well, you are not this objective thing of consciousness and form and magnitude and mass, which has a circumference and a weight and so on and so forth. You are the rest self, and the rest self, not that it's a perfect analogy, of course, would be analogous to the seed. Yoga chittavriti nirodha. The fruit of yoga, i.e. liberation, is the subjugation of nirodha, vritti, perturbation, agitation, modulation. Modulation is self-identification. That would be objectification. Greek, Indian, and Egyptian mysticism, metaphysics, theology, these are all silly little words which all refer to the one and the same thing. Refer to the removal of modulation. So mystical union or divine ascent must be the removal of something which you are not. You know, that meat suit in the mirror. But the removal of it, how? People keep saying, how? And this is like talking about, you know, when someone asks you, do you want something? It's like, well, I want this. And you say, I want an orange. Like, well, everybody knows what an orange is. Okay, you want an orange. You say, I want nothing. And they look at you like you're an alien. You know that. You've done that. We've all done that in our life. What do you want? I don't want anything. What? What? Negation. That's like telling somebody about rest. What does rest look like? Everybody's confused. They see energy as rest and everything upside down and backwards. Anyway, let's get to that. Anyway, he says in this book, Plotinus advises an extraordinary amount of self-purification, often evoking with it venerable terminology of aphoresis. This is a fancy word for apophatism, or taking away, of subtraction or abstraction. That would be talking about if we are ultimately the seed self, not that you should take that analogy too far, then we're taking away. So what is retroduction? What is theology? Removal of modulation. I mean, this is a mass and a magnitude and a volume, and it took work and agitation to create this orange. It took sunlight and water and growth and energy vis-a-vis the apple tree to the orange tree to create it, but that is not who we are. Neither is the meat suit and mirror. So we're taking away. I'm going to want to start peeling this orange and getting orange juice and stuff squirting all over the place, but abstraction, retroduction. Abstraction. This is actually a fancy term that we don't use in common English to refer to taking away of something. Beyond intellection and consciousness. Consciousness would be analogous to water or nous, that which makes life, of course, possible. The nous, of course, would be the signal, that which we truly are. And, of course, affirmation of the total acquisition through negation of the nous is achieved through retroduction. And that's the mystical union, or the theurgy that we're talking about. We're not interested in the radio or the constituent components, the battery, the antenna, all the stuff that makes up the radio. We're saying that we are the seed essence of that which is transcendent to which is temporal, i.e. the radio. People say, what happens when we die? It's like, I don't know. What happens to the signal when you smash the radio? I love questions that answer themselves. What makes you think you are that which dies? I mean, I hate people that answer questions with another question, but that one's actually appropriate. What do you think mystical union is? How would you engage in apophatism, this retroduction? This removal of modulation. It's like when you tell someone what rest is and they can't wrap their brain around it, that's like asking them, what's a signal that doesn't have a frequency or wavelength? And they can't wrap their brain around that either. Wouldn't that be rest energy? The true definition of energy, which doesn't have any Cartesian value. If you can point to it or say it exists, then it can't be the transcendent self, because exist is something with mass and magnitude, which has a beginning in time and therefore an end in time. You know, it has a Cartesian value on an XYZ coordinate axis. You could point to it, and therefore it is an object. And if you could point to it, and it of course therefore is an object, then it can't be the transcendent self. This means that which is the pure subject, which is never the object to be seen, which cannot be said to exist. People say, what's the ether? Well, people say, what's the ether made of? Nearly a perfect analogy for the self, and ultimately they're intrinsically linked, but that's a matter for another discussion. It's like, well, what is the value of that which doesn't have any constituent components? If it had constituent components, it wouldn't be the ether. If you could say, what is the ether? What is a reference to phenomena? Well, the ether is not phenomena, it's noumena. It's pure subject. Consciousness would be analogous to water. Nous, of course, to the signal. Mentation, of course, would be the broadcast and the modulation. Unfortunately, in English, there's no distinction between consciousness. Unfortunately, they translate a lot of texts, especially Advaita Vedanta and Upanishads. They'll talk about pure consciousness. Like texts like this, the Upadisa Sahasrari and the Vivekachudamuni of Advaita Vedanta. Unfortunately, in English is translated as pure consciousness, but there's no such thing as pure consciousness, because consciousness has a beginning in time and an end in time, and it is consubstantial. It's consubstantiality, just like the broadcast out of the radio, because the broadcast is not to be confused with a signal. The broadcast is analogous to consciousness. What's coming out of the speaker here is the interpolation of the signal, which is not in the radio. It's everywhere and nowhere. Even you know that. It's interpretation of the signal vis-a-vis the antenna, which would be analogous with water, which of course is necessary for life, and that secret ingredient, which is the divine logos, which is the reason why it's tattooed on the backside of my right hand, for the manifestation and the joining. The third thing which is necessary to combine two things. That's Timaeus 23c. One thing I can't stand to, a lot of the stuff that's attributed to Plato was not written by Plato. The Timaeus, the Parmenides, many parts of Plato's Republic, not written by Plato. Not. Far, far more ancient. Even the Greek itself is way more archaic than the Greek of Plato. Seed, of course, would be analogous to the Atman, or the transcendent self, the intellective self, to growth and light and water. Conscious self, of course, the flesh of the apple, the flesh of the orange, kind of using a crude analogy. But ultimately we're trying to get to the point of understanding what would be the methodology of divine union or mystical ascent to the One, because it can't involve doing things, i.e. action or agencyship. People can't wrap their mind around something that is not doing to accomplish something. It's just like talking about rest or talking about not wanting something. People can't wrap their brain around it. People say, what does rest look like? Oh, you mean like somebody sleeping? No, 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 like the true definition of actual inertia or energy, or the ether. Because all fields are ether perturbation modalities. And in ether perturbation modality, the very term perturbation means disturbance. And as I've said over and over again, hell necessitatively must, by definition, using logic and retroduction, Greek, Indian, and Egyptian mystical union principles, must necessitatively be the removal of modulation. What does rest look like? Huh? Here's another passage from the guy. This guy's very, very intelligent, but he never gets anything. He's not interested in this methodology, just comparing one thing to another. Mystical self-reversion should be distinguished from both epistrophe. Epistrophe means rolling back towards the self, i.e. disobjectification. It occurs in every stratum of Platinian reality, and also from that of mystical catharsis. It's often assumed that self-reversion, when he says self-reversion, he just means retroduction, or turning back into that which you inherently are. It'd be like the gold extracting itself from this host rock. You know, there might be $400 or $500 worth of gold here. You can actually see it right here. There's a bunch of gold here. Like if the gold were sentient, transcendently sentient, i.e. the true self, and extracting itself out from the host rock, that would be self-reversion. What's the opposite of dilution? Well, people say concentration. That's why what is referred to rest is no different than talking about concentration. But not trying to think your way out of a thinking box, because you can't get that. Because as soon as you say concentration, they immediately think of thinking concentration. They're starting to burn the wood between their ears, because when you say concentration, that's what everybody's thinking of, and it is not that. Well, if it's not doing and it's not non-doing, how do you do it? Exactly. What if the gold were sentient? What if the seed were sentient, and it perpetually identified, been looking in the mirror, identifying as this hot, beautiful, juicy orange, but it had worked its way back. Say, I'm not the flesh, I'm not the water, I'm not the constituent components as a mass and magnitude of this orange. I am the seed rest that's within it. Because within the seed, you know, is the entire tree and a gazillion future oranges. It's kind of a near perfect analogy. Go on with this one passage. It'll be the last one I read from the guy. Self-reversion, catharsis, simply two ways of describing the same process using respectively positive and negative metaphors. Shedding of psychic intellectual accretions to reveal what is truly oneself, also might be described as a refocusing of attention on the center of the self. But you can't focus on it because it's pure subject. And this, of course, is why we have via negativa. And this is where all the Buddhists in the world misunderstand the dharmanara. It's common via negativa, neti neti. This is not the self, meaning the soul. This is not the Atman, that's not the Atman, that's not the Atman. Of course, if there were no Atman, you wouldn't have to point out what's not the Atman. That's extremely anti-intellectual in their conclusions. It's called a fallacy of composition that they keep making over and over again. Yet, while Plotinus describes self-reversion occasionally overlapping with catharsis, there's two processes that are nevertheless conceptually identical. The MSR, meaning mystical self-reversion, entails a crucial moment of self-reflection and self-objectification, which is false, by the way. He says that, not me. Not implied by the purely negative process of catharsis. The important point of the moment of self-objectification, intervening between the initial catharsis and the final union with the One, is typically underappreciated by the commentators who conflate the aphoretic and the epistrophic process. See, this is a brilliant, intelligent academician who could translate ancient Greek and Latin. You know, and I'm sure he's well loved in his field, but this is a guy that doesn't get it. This is like, you know, some sort of alien race that was, you know, studying a mystical text of catharsis, mystical catharsis, like the Upadisa Sahasrati here, for example. It's like, well, it kind of remembers like this, it kind of looks like this, it kind of looks like that, it looks like this element was taken from that. That's nothing to do with it. That's like reading cookbooks. You're not going to feed yourself by reading cookbooks. Cookbooks are about getting the ingredients together and making something that everybody wants to eat that will nourish themselves. And this is what academicians are like. But they're just one level worse than all the religious texts, which is secularized metaphysics. When people keep asking about academician books like this, that I'm reading from, not that book, and the religious texts, they're both equally bad. The academic books are actually worse, but they're both essentially equally. You can't get any answers therein. But even if you read the good stuff, unless you have your mind implanted with a legend, and a legend is like a key in a map. It's like, well, this means this. You have to understand what this via negativa theurgy methodology is for engaging in a mystical union. This divine ascent, well, how would you engage in it? Well, I am none of the psychophysical things, and I can't get there by trying to think my way out of a thinking box. Then you actually have to engage in a cathartic self-extraction that is autonomous from the conscious self and the intellective self. And by the intellective self, I mean the self of thought processes, and in Pali the word is mano-kavinyana, which means thought and consciousness. You can't purify what is inherently has beginning in time, and consciousness and mentation is purely rooted in psychophysicality. I know pure consciousness is a translation which is totally wrong. It exists through countless texts of the Upanishads, including the Upadisahasri and the Vivachudamuni and others, but there's no such thing as pure consciousness. The true English definition of consciousness involves psychophysical consubstantiality between matter and spirit. The word then in Pali is vijnana, which literally means agnosis. It's vi prefixual plus jnana. It's no different than saying agnosis. Agnosis is no different, even though literally translated as ignorance, means no difference than saying illumination. Consciousness is psychophysical illumination. Goes no further than the psychophysical. You cannot therefore purify it. It has a beginning in time, and it is consubstantial, is composed of two things. Anything that's composed of two or more things not only has a beginning in time, but cannot be, by definition, purified. But unfortunately, this is where everybody gets screwed up and they read pure consciousness and they think, well, you can purify consciousness, and of course you can't. Words are merely words, I know that, but it confuses people a lot. Modulation, actions, and identification. This false identification with psychophysicality, of course, is what is implied. Once again, you have to work your way back. And this is the reason why it's called mystical. It is not illogical or rational, but it is not gained through mentation or consciousness. You can't think your way there. You can't. It can't be done. You can't think your way out of a thinking box either. It kind of sounds silly, but it's actually hyper-rational and hyper-logical, because true mystical union is in no way irrational. I mean, it is always painted that way in movies and books, and it's like, oh, you have to take a leap of faith. No, that's what you do in religions. True theurgy and mystical union does not require any sort of leap of faith. It's not irrational, it's hyperlogical, and it is hyper-rational. But it is always painted as, completely, mystical. But what does mystical mean? I mean, 99.9999% of the world has never seen a bear in the wild. By definition, that is way more of a mystical experience, meaning abstruse and occultic, which is really a bad word, by the way, meaning it's just never seen one. Since so few people have seen a bear, you would think that, well, bears don't exist. I don't know anybody that's seen a bear. Most of the world's never seen a bear. Kind of a crude analogy, but of course we all know that they exist. But it is such a strange experience that people can't wrap their brain around it. So once again, obviously hell by definition is perpetual agitation, and heaven thenceforth by inverse reasoning. You can say heaven, you could say rest, you could say nibbana. Nibbana comes from the Pali word nivriti. Nivriti means the end of agitation. So boys and girls, in case you ever wanted to know what nibbana is, the older word. Nibbana is the same as the Sanskrit word nirvana. Nirvana is from two prefixual nir and vriti. Nisbandur nivriti, meaning the end of perturbation or modulation, i.e. agitation. Once again, we're just talking about rest. So hell is rest and liberation. Hell is agitation. Hello! I'll edit that out of this video. Hell is agitation, perpetual agitation. And transcendence and mystical union is absolute rest. That would be the seed extracting itself from the false identity if this orange were sentient, which of course it's not, or the radio itself, the signal extracting itself by removal of modulation, because if the signal were sentient, which of course it's not, it has a frequency, in this case 162.400 megahertz. Frequency and wavelength is no different than saying agitation. If the frequency were transcendently sentient, not existentially sentient, but it's transcendently sentient, which of course it is, this means by removal of its modulation, this radio and no radio on Earth would be able to tune it. It would not even be frequency anymore. Frequency itself is a dissipation of energy. We actually pour energy in to create a modulation, and of course light is a coaxial energy circuit with transverse electrical magnetic. This is the footprint whereby which we could tune it. Well, what would be the case, and it is near a perfect analogy the case, if we could detune the signal that animates this body? This is what is actually meant by a dead man walking. This is exactly what's meant. What does a dead man walking mean? Something, an entity which has died to that which is still animating that puppet. No different than talking about ground or counter space. I kind of laugh at everybody that keeps thinking that counter space is ridiculous. It's no different than talking about an energy ground. Isn't a ground ultimately a portal to rest? This entire conjugate reality is very simple. It's kind of like the magnet. We're all fascinated by the magnet and the magnetic field around it, but magnetism is a dielectric field. What if we were the seed inertia at the center point here? We all think in terms of being relative to time and the passage of time from birth, old age, sickness, and death. And this field that exists around this, the inverse of the hyperboloid, of course, is the torus. But what if we were this center point right here, which, of course, in the ultimate analogy, there'd be no sand pouring through there. The sand would actually be emanating from the center to either side. You know, there's no time there. There's no existence there. There's no modulation there. Out here, we actually have volume and frequency and magnitude. And we have that which everybody recognizes, but nobody can wrap their mind around rest. I can't see a methodology of mystical union whereby which modulation is removed and that you are at peace as yourself, within yourself, as Plotinus says, monos pros monon, or the one to the one, which really doesn't translate into English very well. But if you read the original Greek, it's actually very sublime and beautiful, monos pros monon. So rest is antecedent to measure, rest is antecedent to time, magnitude, and objectivity. Nobody measures time at the center of this hourglass. They measure time accruing here, and negative time here, time counting down here, time adding up down here, but there is no time here, is there? There's nobody on this earth that's ever tried to measure time right here. Well, this is the rest point of being. We all live out here, and we identify with the orange and the globes of the hourglass. You know, our birth, old age, sickness, and death, but we are none of those things. Well, we can't be by definition. And there's only one nexus in methodology for mystical union, and that is this objectification. It is negative theology. It is theurgy. The Buddhists got everything wrong when they were talking about anatta. It's just the common neti via negativa methodology for trying to engage this apophatic principle of subjective synthesis through objective negation. This is not the self, that's not the soul, that's not the soul, rupa nata, veda nata, sana nata, sankara nata, vinya nata. They completely misunderstood it. That all happened about 1600 years ago, but that's not the crux of discussing this video, talking about mystical union and divine descent. But it is all hyper-rational, but you're not going to get it from books of academia, and you're not going to get it from a religious text. You just shouldn't go looking there. You're not going to find it, and life is short. Life is too short to read trash. I hope you like these videos. If you'd like me to go much deeper into the subject, I certainly can. Let me know. Any donations always warmly welcome. My free books and articles are below, including any donation link below in the description. Everybody asks for my email. And the books and free articles that I've written, and they're right here below in the description. I hope you have a lovely week. Lux et Veritas.